Welcome to the 2023 Plavnik Lecture. It's wonderful to see you all here. And before I introduce our speaker, I want to say just a word about the significance of where we are in the planning program. This is the 60th anniversary of the master's program. The undergraduate program was established a couple of years earlier in 1957. So over the next academic year, next semester and into the fall, we're going to be celebrating the impact that planning has actually made, not only at UVA, but across the world. So this is the kickoff of those events. So stay tuned for that. A friend and colleague of mine, John Gardner, once said, "We must design our efforts for the long haul. Short-term programs won't do it." Gardner's reminder frames Professor Mukhija's topic tonight. Short-term efforts do not and have not led to a realization of the American dream. We are so delighted to have Professor Vinit Mukhija here with us as this 2023 lecturer. He's a professor of urban planning, the former chair of the Department of Urban Planning, and has a courtesy appointment in Asian American Studies at UCLA. He is leading the Department of Urban Planning's efforts to develop a new one-year self-supporting graduate professional degree program in real estate development that situates the development pedagogy within a broader framework of politics, policy analysis, sustainability, and equity, all areas we know well here. His research focuses on housing and the built environment. He is known for his scholarship on cities and the informal economy, affordable housing and urban design, and the redevelopment and upgrading of informal housing. It spans informal housing in slums, in developing countries, and third world-like housing conditions, colonias, unpermitted trailer parks, and illegal garage apartments. Now, there's a lot I could say about him, but I absolutely told him I love his academic background. It just fits us perfectly. So listen up. He is trained as an urban planner, PhD at MIT, from MIT. He is an urban designer, a Master's of Urban Design, University of Hong Kong, and an architect, Master's from the University of Texas, Austin, and a Bachelor's of Architect from the School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi. So he fits the bill with the exception of architectural history, and I see my friend Jody back there, and you and Richard can take care of that. We'll get him enrolled. He's had professional experience as an urban designer and physical planner in India, Hong Kong, and Kuwait, with new town design proposals and projects in India, China, and the Middle East. Before coming to UCLA, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Fannie Mae Foundation. His work has been funded by a number of foundations and organizations, including the California Policy Research Center, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, the United Nations Development Program, and the World Bank. Last but not least, he's a prophetic, is that right? Prolific and prolific writer. His latest book is Remaking the American Dream, the informal and formal transformation of single-family housing cities, from MIT Press. Earlier, Squatters as Developers, co-edited The Informal American City and Urban Design, The Struggle for the Public City, among many, many other articles and books. It is an honor to have you at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mukhija from UCLA.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne. I wanted to also thank Dean Marlo Hudson, certainly Chair Suzanne Muma, got tremendous help from Dana Paulson, Ashley Dufflo, and I want to thank all of you for joining me here for this lecture this evening. So thank you. I am going to talk about, this draws mostly of my position as a scholar who studies most global South cities looking at American cities. And when I think of American cities, I think of single-family housing as the main mode of capturing the American dream. And this is why I'm calling it the view from the global South, because I'm going to try to center informal housing as central to my perspective of looking at single-family housing in US cities. Here's a short overview of what I'm hoping to do. 4 sections, the main one being the nature of informal housing, in which I will share 4 empirical vignettes of informal housing in US single-family housing. When I say informal, to me, I define it simply as unregulated housing. Housing that doesn't meet planning requirements, codes in that sense. Sorry, I should say it could meet planning requirements, but it doesn't have planning permissions. So here's a little bit just on my positionality, background, context. I studied informal settlements in Mumbai most of all. This is a shot of Mumbai. It's a city that is known for informal settlements or slums. I prefer to call them informal settlements, where the majority of the city, in fact, lives in some form of informal settlements on a small minority of the land. And a global South perspective, in my mind, is something that privileges groups like those residents in our urban planning discourses. When I moved to Los Angeles after my PhD to teach at UCLA, I was very interested in seeing if there was informal housing in California. And I had read about colonias in the Texas border regions. And I thought, surely there was something like that in California. And I came across this settlement called Doroville, which was on a Native American tribal land in Riverside County. It had about 250 trailers, mixed land uses, as you can see, quite a thriving community that would be almost 3,000 people in the peak farming season, because many of the residents were farm workers. They would rent out, sublet to other migrant farm workers in the peak farming season, and this place would have about 3,000 residents. Here's a view at the street level where you can see the level of care people were doing into their houses. It's another long story, but this place was cleared in 2014. And I shouldn't say that without getting into it, but it was deemed unfit for habitation and it was cleared. But as I started spending time in LA, it became clear to me that although I hadn't read much about unpermitted housing, informal housing in urban areas, unpermitted housing was quite common. This is from advertisings on lampposts for renting out garage units, subdivided houses in the neighborhood of Pacoima, which is in northeast San Fernando Valley, part of the city of LA. It's a working class Latinx community, about 95% Latino, and informal housing is significantly present as a part of its fabric. It's zoned mostly for single-family housing. but people have backyard units. They've got their units, main units divided into second units. Sometimes there's a third unit. So I started realizing the presence of unpermitted housing, informal housing, much more closer to my life than farm worker communities 2 hours away, which Doraville was. Soon I became familiar with my students living in informal housing. This is a same house, 2 views of the same unit from outside and inside, a garage converted in Westwood that the owners prefer graduate students because they're quieter. They also leave every 1 or 2 years. And this unit is handed down from planning students, graduating students to incoming students, and it often always kind of has a planning student in it. But this is housing that's right next to the campus. I'm not sure if Charlottesville has informal housing. I would be surprised if it doesn't. Part of the reason we have informal housing is, of course, affordability, which is a function of poverty, but also the supply. And the supply debate of restricting and having whether suburbs that are exclusive or city neighborhoods that are exclusionary is very old. Here is a cover from 1971. It's the same debate you hear about today, about trying to open up residential areas to allow more housing and opposition from residents of those suburbs. But it's not just a suburban issue. It is very much a part of cities like LA, cities that are single family, have a significant part of single family zoning. This was from the 2020 campaign, where President Trump and Secretary Ben Carson wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in opposition to what the Obama administration had done, which was small moves to try to force, not even force, ask local governments to study their zoning so that it could maybe made more inclusive. But this was a criticism of that the federal government at any level should not be involved in changing the fabric of American communities. And the Trump calculation, I think, was quite rational in the sense, although 83% of Americans live in cities and urban neighborhoods, more than 50% of them identify their neighborhoods as suburban, which is mostly single-family housing, which is also not just housing, but also no other land use in it other than residential. So this is what the Trump campaign was counting on when they said, we'll protect the suburbs. That election turned out differently, but the reality of American cities is such that single-family zoning, as you can see on the right column, is significant. And in places like Phoenix, San Antonio, San Jose, about 90 to 95% of the residentially zoned land is reserved for single-family housing. So that is the dominance of this, not just in our suburbs, but within our cities. And with the need for housing, with the ability for people to afford less housing, there have been some really remarkable state-level interventions in California to open up single-family zoning. Starting with 2016, we had 2 remarkable bills, SB, 2219, Assembly Bill 2299 and Senate Bill 1069, that forced local governments across all jurisdictions in California to be a little more liberal and allow accessory dwelling units or second units on single-family zoned lots. I partnered with one of the senators who was behind Senate Bill 1069 to push for more liberalization of those rules and push for amnesty for 5 years for unpermitted second units on single-family zone lots. We wrote an op-ed together, Senate Bill 13. I went in and gave testimony to the Senate, California Senate, and this was approved. But this was sort of a desperation that state intervention had to come in and push local governments to act, to liberalize their zoning, to make it a little more inclusive. I am going to focus a lot on research that I have shared in these 3 books. The book in the center is my sole authored book that most of the research I'm sharing is going to come from, but it's bookended by these 2 edited volumes that Suzanne mentioned. So here's, to get us started in a way, my research question. And it's the research question that has guided my research in Duroville, Mumbai, but it's pretty much understanding the nature of informal housing and trying to understand, once we know the nature a little better, how should planners, built environment professionals, policymakers address that situation. So for this, I'm drawing on multiple methods you will see, but also some ongoing research that I am doing in the neighborhood of Pacoima, the one I mentioned a little earlier, the Latino working class neighborhood in Northeast San Fernando Valley. So here, before we get there, here's a little bit of the conventional wisdom on what the literature and conventional expectations are. This is a very remarkable newspaper article from the LA Times in 1987, where they sent their reporters on a sample of 500 addresses across the county to see if there were unpermitted conversions. And they concluded that there were not as many as they thought, but they captured it in a way that is so LA, as if, 1, we expected to be immigrants. 2, we're almost more worried about the cars being outside of the garages and taking up street parking rather than but of course, there's about substandard housing too, so I shouldn't say that. But there's a lot more concern about the cars than the people. By that time, as I was doing this research, it was quite clear to me that this was not just an issue for immigrants in LA. I had been talking to colleagues who had lived in informal housing, converted garages, and it was much more common. So I wanted to get a sense of understanding this nature a little better. The other reason I became interested was, in the Global South, a conventional wisdom of how you address slums or informal settlements is to legalize them and provide property rights. And the logic is, once people are secure with their property rights, they can get loans and they can invest in their homes. It's extremely popular, but the contrarian view is that it doesn't work that well because people really can't get loans. And it doesn't help improve the quality of informal settlements as easily as well as the literature suggests. So instead, the contrarian way focuses on upgrading, where governments have a role to come in and help communities get those loans, provide grants, provide technical assistance. If they can't do legalization, provide amnesty to provide some security of tenure. Think about the tenants who live in these units in addition to the owners. So a lot more complex approach that I think also makes sense in LA and places across the US, where I think we have increasingly researched that informal housing is more common than we would like to think. The other context I want to, or debate I want to frame this is in who should do all of this? What's the role? We have been so stifled by local opposition to zoning reform that we are increasingly relying on state governments to do this. And it makes a lot of sense. However, I'm going to try to make a case that there are opportunities for pushing local decision making and that states should get more involved in regional governance, as well as pushing for funding and providing funding to local governments in upgrading. One of my experiences while I was working and studying the state interventions in California that were remarkable, but I remember one of my colleagues from UCLA City Lab, Jane Blumenfeld, who was working with Dana Cuff and helped push the Assembly Bill 1069, said our governor at that time, Governor Jerry Brown, had made it clear that he liked a certain kind of bill. And that bill was other people's money. That's the one he wanted to push, that's the one he wanted. And I think we need that state preemption, but we need a lot more of state funding for the upgrading approach also. Okay, so here's to the core of the presentation, the 4 vignettes of informal housing. Let me start with the first one about understanding their prevalence and spatial nature. So this is a photograph from a real estate listing from the Redfin website. And as you can probably tell, this garage is not used for parking cars. It's closed, sort of protected with those planters. And so what I realized that over time, we could look at these one of the challenges, how do we figure out how many informal units are there? It's kind of difficult to tell. But real estate listings can be a source for that information because owners are interested in letting potential buyers know that there's a second property, that there's a rental stream that could happen. So you will sometimes get clues in the photographs. You'll get clues like this, where someone has a photograph to show, look, I really have a hidden second bathroom behind the closet, and you can rent this space out as a second unit. And they will mention clues like rental opportunities. You can sort of see there's a discrepancy between what the assessor says is the area of the unit and what the advertiser says is the size of their unit. So I thought, well, let's just look at how many units we could find this way. And it was about 5.5% of the units for sale at that time definitely had or likely had a unpermitted second unit. And I know that some people will not advertise, and then there are others that are more ad hoc. They're sort of a little temporary, and that they won't be there. So I took the liberty of doubling this 5.4 to 10.8. So my estimate is that of 500,000 single-family houses in the city of LA, we have about 50,000 unpermitted second units. And there's some other research that comes around similar. So it's not as common as Mumbai, but it's still a significant amount of housing units. This is an attempt to look at the distribution of these units. So if you know LA, and you can see perhaps from these median home list prices, which are higher because they're only single family houses, So this is not how high these are. But West LA and Central LA have the highest home prices. They're the more affluent parts of the city. East LA, South LA, and North Valley are some of the less affluent. Pacoima is part of the North Valley. So but if you look at the distribution, what was interesting for me was that places like West LA and Central LA have a fairly high proportion of unpermitted second units. West LA has 5.2, quite close to the 5.4%. Central LA has a lot more. So there might be, and there are, more dire needs for housing assistance in working class neighborhoods. But informal housing is common all across the city of LA. And I went on to look a little bit at the county of LA, and I found county was even more prevalent than the city of LA. So this is just to give you a sense that it's not limited to just working class neighborhoods. I was also interested in seeing the typology, and I was a bit surprised. I thought it would be mostly garages, but it turns out about 50%, over 50% of these unpermitted units are just backyard constructions. Unpermitted, but backyard constructions. And what you see at the bottom is what I call formal. You know, when I looked at the real estate listing, there were definitely some formal. Some of them were older, grandfathered in units, but they all follow a similar typology of more backyard units than garage units. And in some ways, I think that happens because a garage unit is a little more visible from the street. A backyard unit can be more hidden. So there is some incentive for a homeowner wanting to do an unpermitted unit to do it in the backyard. But it's also easier to do when you have a big backyard. And so that's why I think there's a lot more prevalence in a significant presence of informal units in more affluent parts of the cities with the bigger backyards. In Pacoima, as we've been doing this, continuing looking at what's happening there, this is sort of a schematic of the different kinds of units you'll find. So there are 2 units, there are 3 units. Sometimes the main unit is subdivided into 2 units. So there's a significant density of units. And one of the things I've been studying is seeing how they're spatially used. And it's interesting to me, as this sort of a little bit digresses from the talk, but that they are done in a way that they're almost informal subdivisions, separate out, but when there is a event in the house, those cars will come out on the street, and then you can have a more shared public space on the lot. But by and large, people are careful not to park their cars on the street, but park them on their lots, because when they park them on the streets, that's when you get complaints from neighbors. Second, I want to look at the conditions and complaints. So here is another informal unit. This was in the real estate listings. I wanted to use this in my book. And you can't take a photograph from Redfin and put it in the book. So I was desperate. So I emailed the realtor. I said, you know, you have this. I'm interested in using this. Do you mind if I use it? And I was definitely certain he would say no. But he said, sure, let me send you a high resolution image. And so the part of it is, it's just a known fact in the real estate industry that there are going to be unpermitted units. So he wasn't concerned about trying to hide it. So I got this very nice, this is a not so nice unit. You can see the kitchen is, this unit, if there is an inspection, this can be dismantled in just a matter of minutes, really. There's very little investment that goes in this unit. And this is the kind of unit you might not see in the real estate listings. This is a unit that I stumbled across, again, thanks to, much of this research I've done is thanks to students who know a family member who has a second unit. And they've taken me. This is from San Francisco, where one of my former students told me that their uncle was building a detached backyard unit. And this was, in today's money, this would be about $25,000, and this would rent for $1,500 to $1,800. They would recoup the investment in 2 years, but this is, again, a fairly common thing you can find in places like San Francisco, where you do have a backyard at times. So I wanted to see who was getting the complaints about unpermitted units, and I think I need to speed up a little bit. So you can get a complaints database, and it seems like South LA, as I mentioned, is one of the less affluent parts. Southwest LA is the more affluent, and you can see that there are a lot more complaints in South LA than there are in West LA, even though West LA with 19 has more informal proportion of units. And this is what you will see in other parts. You'll see places like North Valley, the Pacoima area gets a lot more complaints. And part of the problem is, if you have more complaints, these are partly because you have poor conditions, it's likely. But if you have more complaints, building inspectors coming, you're less likely to improve the quality of your units. But if you're in West LA, you get less complaints, you keep improving that. So there is a odd way of the rich are more likely to benefit from an informal unit, build wealth, than if you are less affluent. The other interesting thing in LA is the complaints are more about garages. People don't complain that much about backyards because people with backyard units tend to maybe use the garage for parking, use their driveway for parking also. With a garage conversion, it is you lose the parking space, your neighbors get to see it, they complain about it. So I was just surprised to see how garage conversions dominate in the complaints. Third, I mentioned these legalization efforts, important bills that have made accessory dwelling units much more legally possible in state of California. And you see the numbers here. This is what's happening in statewide. City of LA has been at the cutting edge of having permitted ADUs or second units. So I wanted to see a little bit of where these were getting built. And here is some data that tries to look at informal units 2012 versus before COVID in 2019. And if you look at South LA, the poorer part, its proportion of informal units has actually increased because I think the challenging thing with this is even if we saw higher numbers, we would be worried that those are maybe outside investors who are building those. Because part of the problem is, and we saw this in Pacoima, City of LA wanted to do a pilot project in Pacoima. This was being done by an organization, Pacoima Beautiful and UCLA City Lab. And they went to try to get a volunteer who would build the pilot project. Funding was going to be available through self-help credit union, but they needed a homeowner who was interested. Many of them were. They wanted a homeowner who didn't already have an informal unit. That reduced many of those interested people. But the other folks who were still interested and didn't have an informal unit couldn't do it because they already had too much debt, or they didn't have enough equity in their houses. So even though they had a lender lined up to do this pilot project, they just couldn't find someone who would be able to qualify for the loan. And the usual challenge with ADUs is it's hard to get the loan. But here it was going to be easy, but they couldn't find it. And I think this is a problem that is prevalent across the city, other parts of California, where you have homeowners, either they have an informal unit or they won't qualify for a loan because they already have too much debt or enough. They don't have enough equity in their houses. They may have a second mortgage that they had to take out for some other kind of expenses. Okay, last. This is moving away from LA. This is Vancouver. This is again advertising informal housing. This is my parents' language, Punjabi. I can understand it, I can't read it. But Vancouver has a big Indo-Canadian population, and informal second units are a big part of their landscape. So this is advertising that. Vancouver has this interesting building typology where there is it's a semi-basement, but it's only about 6 to 18 inches underground, and it's a space that's used to protect from the moisture, provide storage equipment. So the single-family houses typically will have it. But it's also a place that so easily lends itself to becoming an informal second unit. So this was a very nice Airbnb that I stayed in. You go down and you go in, and it's lovely. The only challenge with these spaces sometimes is the height is a little low. It works for me, but it's a challenge for other people. But it is so much part of the typology that newer buildings that were done 60s, 70s, they were designed in a way, they're called Vancouver specials, to have a floor at the lower level that once they got the permit, they knew this was going to be a second unit. So much so that about 1/3 of all single-family houses in Vancouver have an unpermitted second unit. The good thing is, the city of Vancouver is open about these numbers. It doesn't try to hide it. It recognizes it. It tries to help people. Its fire department gives out free fire alarms, smoke alarms to anyone. It encourages them to take it. But it's a big issue. So they have had, and this is particularly since the Second World War, where homeowners at that time were encouraged to do a unit because we needed housing supply. But after the war, there were attempts to shut these units down, and they never quite succeeded. During the 70s, the city did a couple of pilot projects in smaller areas where they asked neighborhoods, would you like to legalize these units? And this is the 70s. They only asked the property owners, but they started having a tradition of asking people. So in 1988, with the municipal election, they decided they would survey citywide. And they would ask people, as you can see in the red, do you want to discuss? Not do you want to legalize? Do you want to discuss secondary suites in your neighborhood? And then the election results are here. About 3/4 of the single-family neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that are on the top in that darker legend, said, okay, we want to discuss this. 1/4 said, we don't even want to talk about it. That's a little bit like, when we started having a real estate development proposal being discussed in urban planning, about 1/4 of our faculty said, we don't even want to talk about this. But slowly we sort of moved. But here, 1/4 said, no, we don't want to talk about it. 3/4 said, yes, let's discuss. And then the city took a year, got some input, but did neighborhood reviews from 1989 to 1992, 93, where they went by neighborhoods. They shared data. This is what we think is your number of neighborhoods. By that time, they already made one decision. They changed the decision from allowing secondary suites to saying, to allow what they call revenue suites. So they kind of said, everyone can do a family suite, which is for your family members. But if you want to rent it out, that's what we will call revenue suites. And that's what we will going to vote on, because we see there's enough support for a family suite already. And there's too many of these. And we can't shut them down. We try shutting down, people keep appealing. So that's done. We're keeping the family suites. So they did this across neighborhoods, and some of these meetings were very contentious. And they were explicitly racist, because you had a lot of homeowners who would complain about the Indo-Canadian and the Chinese-Canadian families that lived in the unpermitted units, but got to vote in this. They were encouraged to be part of the voting. So it was highly, highly contentious meetings, but the city stuck with it and said, no, we're going to do these meetings, we'll take our time, and we will do it, keep getting the results. So about 2/3 of those 3/4 neighborhoods said, let's allow revenue suites. So that took it to about half the single-family zone said in 1993, they changed the zoning. Half of them really became that you could add a second, all of them you could add a family suite. In half who said yes, you could add a secondary suite, a revenue suite. And then the city said, okay, we'll shut these down in 10 years. And when 10 years happened, they're like, how do we shut these down? There's so many of them. And by that time, people who voted no saw, wow, those property values in the places with the secondary suites are actually higher. They didn't drop. So by 2004, everyone was on board, and the entire city was changed to allow. But this is not just Canada. If we look at Minneapolis, Minneapolis did not something so detailed, but they did 5 workshops, which is a lot more than happened in LA. But they did 5 workshops, they did an online survey, and they had 90% of respondents say, okay, let's allow second units. And that, in both Vancouver and Minneapolis, has led to, from allowing second units, to much more higher density. In Minneapolis, the pathway to that higher density has been trying to assure housing activists that are worried about affordable housing displacing, with the city saying, okay, we are going to upzone, but at the same time, we're going to allow inclusionary zoning, we are going to double the housing budget, and we're going to proactively preserve existing affordable housing. So, but it does suggest that there are opportunities of some grand bargains and changes at the local level. Okay, I will try to wrap up in the last couple of minutes. So we see that informal housing is prevalent. There is more burden on immigrant communities. It is a challenge for many working class owners to access financing. But in addition to legalization, I think what we need is strategies that are still resisted, but are at least accepted as strategies of upgrading in the global south, which include let's provide housing finance assistance to homeowners. Let's think about tenants. Let's provide technical assistance to homeowners. So I think there is a need for a much broader package of policies than changing zoning. Second, even though we have had so much resistance at the local level to zoning changes, because property owners of single-family houses can benefit from that increased density on their lots, as they realized in Vancouver, I think there is an opportunity to think about more deliberation, more broadening of participation. Let's get, we talk about our young people not voting. I think that we could get them involved in these neighborhood decisions. Let's have 16, 17, 18-year-olds vote about it, but get involved in those local decisions. And I am hopeful. I think as a planner, I do want to see more local deliberation and decision-making. But I am frustrated by the obstacles. I am a bit optimistic with the fact that homeowners will financially benefit from it, but I would like to see more participation on that end, including then it makes it much more easy for us to demand state governments to help on the financial side rather than the zoning side. Thank you.